Hello and welcome dear students. In today's lecture, we will be talking about a very important topic in comparative politics, that is classical theory of federalism. Let me first highlight the objectives of today's lecture. Number 1, to understand the genesis of theoretical debate on federalism. Number 2, to assess the role and importance of classical theory of federalism. Number 3, to know the conditions defined by classical theorists for a federal system. And lastly, to critically assess the theory of classical federalism. First, let us talk about the genesis of theoretical debate on the theory of federalism. Dear students, you know the intellectual debate about modern federalism, its meaning and significance can be traced back to the late 18th century. The peculiar circumstances that surrounded the shift from confederation to federation in the United States of America in the years between 1781 and 1789 shaped and molded the nature of the subsequent intellectual debate in a way which had far-reaching consequences for understanding one of the most important historical innovations in modern government and politics. The American federal model, established in 1789, was based upon a set of core principles that were consciously imitated by others, and in consequence it helped to spark an enduring analytical debate about what it meant to be federal. In this sense, the American federal precedent corresponded simultaneously to both theory and practice. Federalism rests on an idea of shared and multi-layered sovereignty enshrined within a particular configuration of political institutions. In federal systems, at least two levels of government, the center and the states, share in the task of governing, but have their own spheres of autonomy. Their joint and individual roles are typically protected by a written constitution with a Supreme Court serving as an umpire in case of disputes. Federalism is a method for sharing sovereignty and not just power between governments within a single state. It is a constitutional device presupposing a formal political agreement establishing both the levels of government and their spheres of authority. So, like the constitutions within which they are embedded. Federations are always a deliberate creation. The United States of America gave us the first modern constitution, and as part of their settlement reflected in that document, it established the world's first and most influential federation. In a federation, legal sovereignty is shared between the federal or national government and the constituent states or provinces. Neither level can abolish the other. It is this protected position of the states, not the extent of their powers, which distinguishes federations such as the United States of America and Canada from unitary governments such as in UK and France. Multiple levels of governance are integral to a federation, whereas in a unitary system, sovereignty resides solely with the center and lower levels exist at its pleasure. A federal constitution allocates specific functions to each tier. The center takes charge of external relations, defense, foreign affairs, and most importantly immigration, and some common domestic functions such as the currency. The functions of the states are more variable, but typically include education, law enforcement, and local government. Residual powers may also lie with the states, not the center. In theory, there are two routes to a federation: either by creating a new central authority or by transferring sovereignty from an existing national government to lower levels. Stephen calls these methods coming together and holding together. In practice, coming together predominates. Federalism is almost always a compact between previously separate units pursuing a common interest. The United States of America, for instance, emerged from a meeting of representatives of 13 American states in 1787. Similar conventions, strongly influenced by the American experience, took place in Switzerland in 1848, Canada in 1867, and Australia in 1897 and 98. So far, restructuring as a federation to hold a divided country together is a rare occurrence. Belgium is the main example. First established in 1830, Belgium has been beset by divisions between its French and Dutch speaking regions. Constitutional revisions in 1970 and 1980 devolved more power to these separate language groups. In 1983, Belgium finally proclaimed itself a federation of three parts: French speaking Wallonia, Dutch speaking Flanders, and Brussels, the predominantly French speaking capital located in the Dutch speaking part of the country. The Belgian experience does suggest that federation can be an alternative to disintegration, a lesson of value to other states confronting strong divisions of ethnicity, language, religion, and culture. What then provokes distinct people to set out on the journey to a federation? Motives are more often negative than positive. Fear of the consequences of remaining separate overcomes the natural desire to preserve independence. Historically, the most common aspiration has been to secure the military and economic bonus accruing to large countries. More recently, however, interest in federalism has focused on its potential in enabling people with conflicting identities to continue to live together within a single state, as in Belgium. Riker, an expert on federalism, emphasizes the military factor. He argues that federations emerge when there is an external threat. The American states, for instance, joined together in 1789 partly because they felt themselves to be vulnerable in a predatory world. When large beasts are lurking in the jungle, smaller creatures must gather together for safety. Or, as the American statesman Benjamin Franklin put it, we must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately. The military case for forming new federations is currently rather weak given the paucity of major wars in the 21st century. Even when a common threat such as terrorism does emerge, coordination between existing states serves the purpose more readily than sharing sovereignty through a new federation. But it would be wrong to regard military motives as the sole reason for federation making. The federal bargain has also been based on the economic advantages of scale. Even the Australian and American federalists felt that a common market would promote economic activity. But again, federation now seems to be a rather convoluted way of securing gains from trade. Straightforward free trade areas between neighboring countries are proving to be a more popular way forward. Unlike federations, free trade areas imply no risk to sovereignty. As military and economic arguments for forming new federations have weakened, so interest in ethnic federalism has grown apace. The Belgian experience shows that federations are useful for bridging ethnic diversity within a divided society. They are a device for incorporating such differences within a single political community. People who differ by descent, language and culture can nevertheless seek the advantages of membership in a shared enterprise. The Indian Federation, for example, has so far accommodated growing religious divisions between Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs and Christians. On a smaller scale, the Swiss Federation integrates 23 cantons, 2.5 languages, that is German and French plus Italian, and 2 religions, that is Catholic and Protestant. For a student of modern politics and government, especially for a student of comparative politics, federalism is a wide field of study, complex and fascinating at the same time. In the period, the Constitution of the United States of America 1787 is treated as experiment in establishing a federal system of government. Subsequently, federalism as a mode of political organization was embodied in the constitutions of the Swiss Confederation, the Dominion of Canada and the Commonwealth of Australia. This trend of the increasing of the federal idea is discernible also in the 20th century, in spite of the suggestion of some critics like Harold J. Lasky that, to quote, "the epoch of federalism is over," unquote. Even Casey Ware, a leading exponent of federalism, conceded in 1945 that under pressure of war and economic crisis, the trend in existing federations was towards a concentration of central powers sufficient in some cases to threaten the federal principle. But in 1935, Max Beloff noticed that federalism was enjoying a widespread popularity such as it had never known before. A look at the remarkable array of constitutions enacted and adopted since the end of World War II would show how federalism has been taken to as a means to political unity among the new nations in Europe, South America, Asia and Africa. The growing popularity of federalism in recent years as a model of political organization, the survival of the older federations through the challenges posed by changing circumstances, economic crisis and global wars, and the launching of functional federalism provide a strong justification for a re-examination of the various approaches to the definition of federalism and analysis of federal political system. Dear students, let us now talk about the theories of federalism with special reference to classical theory of federalism. Broadly speaking, attempts to explain the concept of federalism has given rise to three categories of theories of federalism: the classical theory of federalism, the origin theory of federalism, and finally, the functional theory of federalism. But in today's lecture, I will confine my discussion only on classical theory of federalism. In classical theory of federalism, the important concern is to explain what federalism is. This view is based on a study of the constitution and system of government obtaining in the four classical federations, namely the United States of America, Switzerland, Canada and the Commonwealth of Australia. The outstanding exponents of the classical theory were Dicey, Harrison Murray, Jethro Brown Bryce, Robert Garran and K.C. Ware. Robert Garran, an eminent Australian scholar, defined federalism as a form of government in which sovereignty or political power is divided between the central and local governments, so that each of them within its own sphere is independent of the other. At the end of the 19th century, Lord Bryce, in his book American Commonwealth, described the federal and state governments as distinct and separate in their action. The system, he said, was like a great factory wherein two sets of machinery are at work. Their revolving wheels apparently intermixed, their bands crossing one another, yet each set doing its own work without touching or hampering the other. Following the definition of K.G. Bryce, K.C. Ware gave a traditional concept of federalism. In order to assess whether a constitution is federal or not, K.C. Ware applied the test that reads, to quote, "The test which I apply for federal government is then simply this: does a system of government embody predominantly a division of power between general and regional authorities, each of which in its own sphere is coordinate with the other and independent of them? If so, the government is federal." Unquote. These definitions makes it clear that the idea of independence of each government of the other in a dual polity of two levels of government, general and regional, is central to the classical theory of federalism. In order to make the independence of each government real and secure, the classical theorists enunciate the important conditions for a federal system, which are: number 1, a written constitution which lays down the powers to be exercised by the general and regional governments. Number 2, the constitution is to be so rigid that none can amend the constitution by unilateral action, and only by joint action of both the governments can alteration be made in the division of powers. Third, there is to be an independent judiciary to settle conflicts of jurisdiction between both the governments. Number 4, both levels of government directly operate on the life of the citizens. And finally, there should be a allocation of adequate sources of revenue for the government of each level, general and regional. In this context, a great expert in federalism, Naubuz, argues that federalism is an arrangement whereby powers of government within a country are shared between a national countrywide government and a number of regionalized, that is territorially localized governments, in such a way that each exists as a government separately and independently from the other, operating directly on persons and properly of its own and its own apparatus for the conduct of its affairs, and with an authority in some matters exclusive of all the others. In this definition by Nawabuzi, identified principles of federalism in classical sense, like governments rather than geographical entities or peoples as the basis of the federal arrangement. This principle stresses that federalism concerns itself with power sharing between two tiers of government, federal and states, not the relationship between the central government and each national governments, and how geographical political entities and ethnic nationalities share governmental power. Number 2, separateness and independence of each government. The central and regional governments are autonomous in their rights and domains. This autonomy presupposes that they are equally separate in existence and independent from the control of each other. Autonomy in this regard also means legal. For example, the existence of a legislative assembly, the judiciary, state bureaucracy, executive arm of government, etc., and physical existence. Number 3, equality between the regional governments. Equality means that the regional governments should have equal powers. No regional government should have more or less power than the other, or be accorded a special position or attention in the national government. This is because the position of preponderance of power by any of the regional government may create some sense of superiority and arrogance, thereby creating a situation of disequilibrium rather than equilibrium, which the federal system seeks to achieve. Number 4th, number of constituent units. Federalism thrives and flourishes upon a multiplicity of interest groups and constituent units in order to ensure the desired equilibrium. A federal state comprising 2 or 3 states is likely to generate constant conflict, rivalry, and struggle for supremacy. In the case of a federal structure involving 3 states, where 2 states gang up against 1 state or even the central government, the union is likely to be futile. Thus, multiplicity of states guarantees understanding, cooperation, independence, tolerance, and stability of the union. For example, the Federal Union of the United States of America comprising of 50 states. Number 5th is techniques for division of powers. The techniques for division of powers between the central government and the regional governments should be predicted on exclusive legislative list, which defines the powers of the central government, and the residual legislative list, which defines the powers of the state or regional governments. There may yet be a third instrument, the concurrent list, which defines areas where both the central and regional governments may legislate. Number 6 is underlying objectives of the federal arrangement. The federal arrangement is principally provoked in a society by factors such as fundamental differences in race, religion, language, culture, and economics. The essence of the union, therefore, is to unify these differences, or simply put, to ensure peace, stability, unity in diversity, or diversity in unity. Thus, the two principal objectives of federalism are to ensure national unity and regional autonomy. Lastly, constitutional forms. The constitutional form which modern federal governments take presupposes that whereas there is a federal constitution, the states should also have their own constitutions. In order to assert their original authority, in any case, the states could also surrender their original constitution and also accept a new one. The classical theorization of federalism attempts to explain federalism in juristic terms. One merit of such juristic definition is that it enables us to distinguish a federation from a confederation or a mere league of states brought to existence by a treaty, where the common agency created remains dependent upon and subordinate to the will of the governments of the constituent units. On the other hand, the juristic definition enables us to distinguish a federal polity from a unitary state where the constituent governments exercise their powers in subordination to the will and discretion of the general or central government of the whole country. In contrast to both these positions, relationship between the two levels of government in a federation remain coordinate, none being treated as subordinate to the other. Dear students, let us now talk about the critical assessment of the classical theory of federalism. You know, the challenges of the 20th century such as wars and depression, economic planning and social services have made the classical theory of federalism an obsolete. Its critics attack the theory on the ground of legal formalism. According to them, the classical theory explains the nature of federalism purely on the basis of law enshrined in it and the institutional structure created by it. But the legal division of powers is not strictly adhered to by the two levels of government, each of which by practice and usage might encroach upon a field that does not belong to it legally. The theory is also too much legalistic to take into account the convention and usages of extra constitutional character which shape and influence the governmental process in a federal system. The legal institutional approach of the classical theory of federalism has also been criticized as suffering from the formalistic policy. The critics of classical theory raise a further objection about the use of the term independent to represent the relationship between the general government and the regional governments in a federal political system. Independence, they apprehend, might mean isolation, but if a federal polity is to be a working system, neither the general government nor the regional governments can operate in isolation from the other. Therefore, some students of modern federalism prefer the words like potentiality and individuality, coordinate and autonomy to independence for a more appropriate expression of the relationship between the general government and regional governments. In a federation, Professor Livingstone redefines a federal government as a form of political and constitutional organization that unites into a single polity a number of diversified groups or component polities, so that the personality and individuality of the component parts are largely preserved, while creating in the new totality a separate and distinct political constitutional unit. Dear students, to sum up today's lecture, we have tried to discuss the classical theory with a view to present a conceptual analysis of federalism. A review of this theory shows us that it deals with one, that is juristic, or the other aspect, that is institutional of federalism, but not all the aspects. Therefore, each theory of federalism contains some elements of validity and usefulness. Nevertheless, it suffers from gaps and inadequacies. In this context, federalism is a political system which creates in a society broadly two levels of government with assigned powers and functions originating from a variety of factors and political bargain, and displaying a tendency to persist through active response to the challenges of changing environment by process of adaptation through creative modes of institutional as well as functional relationship. In short, the discussion that we have today on classical federalism makes it clear that the idea of independence of each government of the other in a dual polity of two levels of government, general and regional, is the central theme to the classical theory of federalism. With this note, we have ended today's discussion on classical federalism. Thank you for watching it patiently. Hope you have enjoyed. Goodbye and take care.